Good evening, I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily for Wednesday, July 27th. Tonight, more controversy shrouds the actions of Hockey Canada in its handling of multiple sexual assault cases. The organization says it has paid out $7.6 million in 9 settlements related to sexual assault and sexual abuse claims since 1989. Brian Cairo told the House of Commons Heritage Committee that most of that money, $6.8 million, went to victims of serial sexual abuser Graham James. The committee heard yesterday that a senior director of Sport Canada was made aware of an alleged sexual assault involving members of the World Junior Hockey team in late June 2018. But he did not follow up with Hockey Canada over the next 4 years. All right, well, the final 3 days of the reconciliation visit for Pope Francis will take him to Quebec Wednesday and Thursday, and then he'll head north on Friday to Iqaluit. He left Edmonton for Quebec City, where he was scheduled to visit the Plains of Abraham for a tour. The Pope is to have separate meetings with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and with Governor General Mary Simon. The Alberta leg of the Pope's journey is where he delivered a long-awaited apology for abuses at Catholic-run residential schools. All right, well, meanwhile, a recent move by the House of Commons to address worker shortages among interpreters is being criticized by opposition MPs. A 6-month pilot project was launched in June to test out remote translation services. This was amid what Public Services and Procurement Canada called a worldwide shortage of interpreters. Nicole Gagnon of the International Association of Conference Interpreters says her group worries the quality of bilingual translation is under threat. Opposition House Leader John Brassard fears security risks from moving interpretation of closed-door talks off-site. Layoffs among major companies continue to hit Canadian workers, and this time it's in Windsor and Brampton, Ontario. Stellantis NV will be laying off an undisclosed number of employees at its Windsor and Brampton auto assembly plants in the coming months. The company, whose brands include Chrysler, Jeep, Dodge, and Ram, says the layoffs will be part of a push for operational efficiencies in its transition to become a mobility tech company, and as it invests in electric vehicle production. Canada delivered its first grant for the study of magic mushrooms and their impact on treatment-resistant depression. The Centre for Addiction and Mental Health has been awarded the federal grant to study the effects of a psychedelic chemical component in the mushrooms. Researchers at the Toronto Psychiatric Institute will explore whether experiencing the effects of psilocybin is necessary for it to have antidepressant benefits. Study lead Dr. Ishrat Hussain says if psilocybin can treat depression without inducing a psychedelic state, it could be removing the need for psychological support during treatment. On the East Coast, the Nova Scotia government says it has signed a 10-year, $48.8 million contract to renew its fleet of ambulances. Officials say the deal with TriStar Industries in Yarmouth will see the province lease 146 new ambulances, expected to be on the road in August. Under the agreement, the province will also expand the emergency health services fleet of patient transfer units and single paramedic response units. The number of those vehicles is still to be determined. Well, it's debate night for Conservatives in Alberta. 7 people are running to replace Premier Jason Kenney as leader of the governing United Conservative Party. They will square off tonight in Medicine Hat in their first debate. Participants include former Cabinet Minister Travis Taves, Rebecca Schultz, Rajan Sawhney, and Leela Ahir. Also in the race are current MLAs Todd Lowen and party co-founder Brian Jean, as well as former Wild Rose leader Danielle Smith. Profits are up at Rogers Communications Incorporated. The cable, wireless, and media company says it recorded an increase in profit and sales in its latest quarter as its wireless service revenue rose by 11%. Rogers says it earned $409 million in its second quarter, which is up 35% from a year earlier. Rogers says customer credits related to its crippling network outage this month are estimated to cost $150 million, which will be included in its third quarter results. Canadian musician Shawn Mendes says he needs to devote more attention to his mental health. He has announced that he's canceling the rest of his tour dates in North America, the UK, and Europe into 2023. Earlier this month, the artist announced that he was pausing his Wonder World tour for 3 weeks. He said he's toured since he was 15 and that being away from friends and family took a toll on him. He's assuring his fans that he'll continue to make new music and eventually plans to return to the road. Up next, a look at a proposed trip by the U.S. House Speaker to Taiwan. Stay with us. China is warning it will respond forcefully if U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi proceeds with a planned visit to Taiwan. Beijing objects to all official contact between Taipei and Washington, but this time the stakes appear to be higher. Meanwhile, Taiwan's capital is staging air raid drills, and its military is mobilizing for routine exercises in response to China's threats. Ms. Pelosi has not confirmed when or even if she'll visit, but U.S. President Joe Biden last week told reporters that American military officials believed such a trip was not a good idea. Well, with us now is Mr. Bradley Bowman, Senior Director of the Center on Military and Political Power at the Foundation for Defence of Democracies. Mr. Bowman, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So from the sounds of this, there are a lot of risks associated with this visit, Mr. Bowman. So what is the strategic significance of this visit for the United States in particular, if it were to go through?
The strategic significance is that Beijing wants to extinguish democracy in Taiwan. And as part of the process to do that, it wants to isolate Taipei as much as possible politically and diplomatically. And so that's one of the reasons why I, for one, have long thought that it's wise for members of Congress to go to Taiwan to say that we stand with the free people there as they seek to defend their freedoms. And we've seen what happened already to freedom in Hong Kong. And so if you have the Speaker of the House of Representatives, second in line to the president, visiting Taiwan, that's a very significant thing from both the Taiwanese perspective and from the perspective of the Chinese Communist Party. And, in the past, Beijing would complain, they'd issue harshly worded diplomatic communiques, but now they have the military power to potentially back it up. And that's what makes this a little bit more concerning.
And on that point, what do you think China means when it said it would respond forcefully? What would that look like for both the United States and Taiwan?
I think they're being deliberately vague, as is often the case and when one's making threats, because the one issuing the threat doesn't want to constrain themselves. They want to leave their options open. But the goal is to instill fear. And the question is whether the United States and Speaker Pelosi will back down. At this point, I would say, if she didn't go, that would send a horrible precedent that Beijing, more directly the Chinese Communist Party, has a veto over who visits Taiwan. And I think that would be very unfortunate.
And in addition to the threats from China, we also mentioned Joe Biden's remarks about it not being a good idea, according to military officials. So how likely is Ms. Pelosi to visit Taiwan here?
I, as someone who used to work in the Senate and traveled on staff delegations and organized trips for members of Congress and traveled with them on some of those, they're getting briefings from the Department of Defense. They're getting briefings from our intelligence community. Speaker Pelosi and her team are going to have all the information they need to make this decision. But the bottom line, if she goes, is it's going to be the job of the U.S. government to protect her, and it would be very unwise for Beijing to challenge this approach. But this really is becoming quite a high stakes test of will and perhaps a test of strength. And I hope it doesn't come to that. But, we've seen what happens arguably in Ukraine when we allow bullies to have their way. And I think Beijing is trying to bully us, and we shouldn't let them.
So we mentioned what Joe Biden said, but how are other lawmakers in Washington responding to this potential visit?
It's interesting. Things are so partisan and sadly tribalistic at times these days in Washington, D.C. But here's an instance where you have a lot of Republicans, almost all Republicans, coming out in support of Speaker Pelosi, the leader of the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives. The reaction among Democrats is a little bit more mixed, but you have people like Chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Adam Smith, supporting her and her desire to go there. So I'd say generally strong support for her right to go and for her going, particularly among Republicans, but generally also among Democrats as well.
All right, Mr. Bowman, just about a minute left here, but what are you watching for if this visit were to go ahead?
I think the thing for Americans, Canadians, and others to watch here is that the balance of power in East Asia has eroded. And, 10, 20 years ago, it's like we all kind of knew that Beijing wouldn't mess with the United States. That has changed now. And that's why it's more important than ever that we work with our allies to restore deterrence so that Beijing continues to issue strong communiques, but doesn't back it up with military force. But if we allow this erosion to continue, the day may come where it'll be more than words that we see in an instance like this.
Lots to keep our eyes on. Mr. Bowman from FDD, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you.
Stay with us. After the break, we take a look at Arctic security amid warnings that Canada's north may be heating up amid rising Russian military activity in the region. We'll be speaking with Dr. Rob Huebert, Arctic security expert and associate professor at the University of Calgary. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Protecting Canada's Arctic has become a point of focus as threats from Russia and China continue to grow, and the UK seems to be willing to help. The United Kingdom is sending a military expert on Arctic threats posed by Russia and China to work in the British High Commission in Ottawa this September. The UK is dispatching Nick Diggle, a former Royal Navy officer and research specialist in Arctic security. The move follows a warning in March from Canada's defense chief that protecting Canada's Arctic region is a key concern for the armed forces. General Wayne Eyre warned that Russia has reoccupied abandoned Cold War bases in its far north, and he can't rule out a Russian incursion into Canada's Arctic from the north in the decades to come. Well, with us now to unpack the situation in the Arctic is Dr. Rob Huebert, associate professor at the University of Calgary and an Arctic security expert. Doctor, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Always my pleasure.
So in what ways can this Arctic expert from the UK assist Canada beyond its current capabilities?
Well, I don't know how much they're going to be assisting per se. I mean, I saw the press release and I know that's the terminology that's using. I think that the deployment of this individual to Canada is really twofold. First of all, it's to underline the seriousness by which the British are taking this issue. Most Canadians won't be aware, but the British have actually just released an Arctic security policy paper. It's sort of talking about the way in which they see growing threats in the Arctic, what they want to be seeing in terms of trying to restore it to an area of peace and stability, and failing that, being able to respond to a threat. The second factor, of course, that flows from that is that the British are looking for ways of improving their Arctic and high north capabilities. And I suspect that this individual will be coming over to try to gain opportunities for British forces to train more with Canadian forces in the high Arctic.
And we mentioned General Wayne Eyre's warning that a Russian incursion from the north could potentially come in decades to come. So can you tell us a little bit more about how big of a threat Russia and China are in the region currently?
Well, we have to be really careful. What we're hearing from General Ayres and from other senior leaders is that really that there isn't that much of a threat. If you listen carefully to some of their statements, they're saying that there is no immediate threat of a Russian invasion of any Canadian territory. Well, that's a bit of a red herring because it never was a issue since the beginning of the Cold War in terms of any Russian invasion. It's never been about land. It's always been about aerospace and maritime. And in fact, there is a very serious threat. We know that the Russians are developing both aerospace capabilities, hypersonics, and other related delivery systems of a very advanced nature, and new underwater delivery systems of both nuclear and non-nuclear payloads. And that is where the threat comes from. As we look for Russia becoming much more aggressive within the European context, should things really go bad in that particular theater, one of the real possibilities is that the Russians will try to make a move that extends into NATO, but before they would do so, they would try to either blind the Americans or take a significant part of the American offensive capabilities out. That means attacking the North American homeland, and that means attacking us as both a NATO ally and a NORAD ally.
Some very concerning developments on Russia's end there. So just for some further perspective for our viewers, what is the strategic significance of the Arctic for all players?
Well, I mean, we're seeing because of the geography of Russia and the fact that Russia has now become an aggressor state opposed to Western interests, we see the Arctic actually becoming one of the most dangerous strategic environments in the entire international system. It's a little bit out of sight, out of mind, and people say, okay, it's not really going to happen. But if the Russians were to make a move on the Americans at that level, or if the Americans make a misstep, it is going to be fought over the Arctic. Now, when I say over the Arctic, we're not fighting for territory. We're not fighting for the extended continental shelf or to land troops, but basically the engagement at the highest level will in fact be weapon systems that are either based in the Arctic or are moving to take out weapon systems based in the Arctic. And so this is the part that becomes so dangerous. The third factor that we haven't talked about, but we need to, is of course the reality that the Chinese are also building up their capabilities. Now, at this point, are they focused on having an Arctic war fighting capability? And most people are saying that they're not seeing anything yet. But you have to remember that China in 1990 had a defense budget that was less than Canada's. Once they made up their mind to become a major player, they now have the second largest defense budget at about 370 billion. And so one can't rule out an eventual entry of Chinese military capabilities, particularly nuclear-powered submarines, into that region.
Sounds like a lot of action to come in the Arctic. Lots to keep our eyes on. Dr. Huebert, thank you again for your time today.
Always my pleasure.
We'll be right back after a short break on Forum Daily. The U.S. Federal Reserve has raised its benchmark interest rate by 0.75 of a point for a second straight time. This in its most aggressive drive in 3 decades to tame high inflation. The Fed's move will raise its key rate, which affects many consumer and business loans, to its highest level since 2018. The central bank's decision follows a jump in inflation to 9.1%, which is the fastest annual rate in 41 years. By raising borrowing rates, the Fed makes it costlier to take out a mortgage or loans. Consumers and businesses then presumably borrow and spend less, cooling the economy and slowing inflation. All right, well, on Wednesday, Russia's foreign minister denied his country is responsible for the global surge in food prices following its invasion of Ukraine. He is dismissing the so-called food crisis as he completed a visit to several African nations on a continent hit especially hard. Sergei Lavrov addressed reporters and African diplomats in Ethiopia's capital. Many African countries rely heavily on wheat imports from Russia and Ukraine, and African leaders weeks ago visited Moscow to express their food security concerns. But many African nations haven't openly criticized Russia over its invasion of Ukraine. Meanwhile, China's government has rejected a report by the Wall Street Journal as a political lie. The report says Beijing tried to recruit informants in the Federal Reserve System to obtain U.S. economic data. The journal cites an investigation by a Senate panel adds to accusations of Chinese computer hacking and other efforts to steal U.S. commercial and government information. The journal was about a Fed employee who visited Shanghai in 2019 during a bout of U.S.-Chinese trade tensions. The report says he was pressured and threatened with prison to disclose data, including about tariffs. A foreign ministry spokesman, Zhao Lijian, says the report has no factual basis. Western European powers are pressing Iran to agree to a revival of its 2015 nuclear deal. This comes after a months-long standstill in negotiations, warning that what's on the table now is the best possible deal. The foreign policy chief of the European Union, which has chaired long-running talks in Vienna, tweeted Wednesday on this, and he said that now is decision time if we are to save the Iran nuclear deal. French Foreign Minister Catherine Colonna said a return to full compliance with the agreement is still possible. But for that, she says a positive response from Iran is needed as soon as possible. That reflects mounting concern that time is running out to salvage the deal and bring the U.S. back on board. Amnesty International says the Taliban's suffocating crackdown on the rights of Afghan women and girls is destroying their lives. The London-based watchdog said in a new report on Wednesday that since the Taliban took control of the country nearly a year ago, they have violated females' rights. The Taliban have banned girls from attending schools from 7th grade, imposed an all-covering dress that leaves only the eyes visible, and restricted women's access to work. The report reveals how women who peacefully protested these oppressive rules have been threatened, arrested, detained, tortured, and forcibly disappeared. A strong earthquake has killed at least 5 people, injured dozens, and damaged buildings in the northern Philippines. Scientists say this morning's magnitude 7 quake was centered in a mountainous area around Abra province. President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. says the chandeliers swayed and clanked in the presidential palace. Dutch farmers have resumed protests against government plans to reduce nitrogen emissions. Farmers are dumping manure and garbage on highways and setting fires alongside roads, blocking many of them in the central and eastern Netherlands. The latest demonstrations came a day after a government-appointed mediator invited farmers' groups for talks. Farmers say the ruling coalition's targets for reining in emissions of nitrogen oxide and ammonia threaten their agricultural way of life and business. The Jackie Robinson Museum has opened in Manhattan with a gala ceremony. It was attended by the 100-year-old widow of the barrier-breaking ball player and 2 of his children. Rachel Robinson watched the half-hour outdoor ceremony from a wheelchair in the 80-degree heat, and she cut a ribbon to cap a project launched in 2008. Her 72-year-old daughter, Sharon, also watched from a wheelchair, and her 70-year-old son, David, spoke to a crowd of about 200 sitting on folding chairs, which were arrayed on a closed-off section of the major New York spot where the museum is located. It opens to the public on September 5th. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news and on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and make sure to follow our social media accounts. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on Forum Daily.